I might have to mute myself for a good second if they get into a little fit. They've been really good this morning though, so we'll see how we go. But let's go ahead and jump into this. I'm going to go ahead and stop my video while I have the presentation just because it gets really crazy with all this thrown up. All right. Are we good? Can everybody see it where it's supposed to be?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so as Dr. Sandifer already let you guys know, my project is entitled Shoreline Exposure and Human Health in the Gulf of Mexico. And this is my thesis. And unfortunately, it did end up being much longer than I realized it was when I went to put it all together because it is in 2 parts. But really quickly, today we're going to go through a quick literature review, very shortened, the project overview, and then the 2 parts of my project, as well as the conclusion and then relevance for future research. The research has suggested that outdoor environments, in particular green spaces, may be beneficial for mitigating stress, improving social relationships, and conferring other positive influences on human health. A large body of research has been conducted on the benefits of trees, grass, forests, and the presence of other plants to human health known as green spaces, which have been associated with decreased air pollution, noise, increased physical activity, reductions in health inequalities, and positive mental health outcomes. Increasing urbanization has led to a significant amount of research into the salutary effects of green spaces as city planners and organizers seek to design and build environments that are going to better support physical and mental health among dwellers. Blue spaces are more commonly researched now. They are landscape features including water such as coastlines, lakes, ponds, rivers, and provide opportunities for physical activity. And exposure to blue spaces, like green spaces, has been linked to better mental health outcomes. For centuries, doctors have been prescribing the ocean to cure ailments, believing that exposure to it is beneficial to the mind, body, and spirit. But we have only recently started to truly study the effects of blue spaces on human health, and comparatively very little research has been done into blue spaces than green spaces. So really quick, just a rundown of the benefits and disadvantages of blue space exposure. There's a very long literature review that you are more than welcome to read within the body of the document, but this is extremely shortened. So we see increased visibility of nature has been linked to decreased psychological distress and decreased recovery time for post-op patients. Coastal views have been associated with decreased depression in elderly populations and are better predictors of positive mental health outcomes than distance from the coast. Blue spaces provide opportunities for physical activity. Interaction with blue spaces is associated with greater social cohesion and interaction, leading to decreased suicide, decreased mortality, and better physical health, particularly again in elderly populations. And then disadvantages of blue space are also common within the Gulf of Mexico. We have hurricanes, oil spills, Vibrio species exposure, and harmful algal blooms, which have frequently impacted these areas, especially within the last decade. Now, negative health impacts include foodborne illness, deadly wound infections, pulmonary issues, poor health, and psychosocial distress, as well as mental and physical health risks from hurricanes, other extreme weather events, and oil spills. This project is going to try to fill a gap in the literature that Gaskin et al. Actually found in a large literature review that they conducted in 2017. And while the potential for exposure to blue spaces to improve human health is an emerging trend in place-based research, it's clear that coastal blue spaces can confer both health benefits and risks. Negative impacts are not very well juxtaposed against the benefits of coastal areas. And so to address that gap in the research, we split this into 2 parts. Part 1 is a review of human health publications funded by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, known as GOMRI, following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And then part 2 is going to use statistical analysis to compare subjective general health of coastal Gulf of Mexico residents to non-coastal residents using existing national survey data. So part 1, this is the publication that was published in GeoHealth entitled Oil Spills and Human Health, Contributions of the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. Published under my maiden name. If it gets confusing, I'm sorry. I'm confused too. In response to the April 20th, 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill, BP allocated $500 million to research the environmental and health impacts of the spill. The GOMRI was created as an independent entity to disperse those funds over a 10-year period among the 5 research themes of physical distribution of oil, chemical evolution and biological degradation of petroleum dispersants, environmental impacts on the seafloor, water column, coastal waters, beach sediments, etc. Technology developments for improved response mitigation and detection of the spills. And then lastly, the impact of oil spills on public health, later simply called human health, which is the focus of this work, including behavioral, socioeconomic, environmental risk assessment, community capacity, and other population health considerations and issues. Of the 1,747, as of September of last year, papers published within the GOMRI funding, we see all of these as a pie chart of how they are broken down within those categories. Also, publications related to toxic effects of oil and dispersants on non-human organisms were not included, but some may have indirect relevance to human health. So we do have to remember that when we're looking at the 3%, which is the number of publications that they funded. Because those were beyond the scope of the review, our findings should be considered only a portion of the GOMRI contribution to the human health literature. And while 3% may seem like a really, really small number, it is actually a huge increase from the roughly 1% of human health-related studies done during previous oil spills. So, getting into the meat of it all. Dispersants are used to reduce surface tension between seawater and oil, leading to increased aerosol emissions. Ashfar Mohajer conducted 2 studies which mixed dispersants and oil, finding that dispersant oil mixtures had the highest particulate matter concentrations compared to seawater oil alone, but that dispersant oil mixtures actually were lowering volatile organic compound concentrations. Dispersants were also found to decrease the lifetime cancer risk from 57 to 37 cases per billion from VOC exposure, while respiratory burden was increased from increased particulate matter inhalation. Numerous researchers conducted studies on obesogens. These are endocrine disruptors that promote obesity and have been linked to dispersants in oil components. DOS, which is a component of the widely used dispersant Corexit, was found to activate a receptor gene in mice associated with adipocyte differentiation, which is the main target of obesogens, leading Timken to the conclusion that DOS is a potential obesogen. DOS and SPAN80, components of Corexit, are also commonly used in household personal care products and food additives. And Bowers et al. In 2016 tested for additive effects of the chemicals used in conjunction, finding that they work synergistically with substantially more impacts than either on their own. So that was fun parts of dispersants. Next, we looked at the oil contamination stories. Shellfish contamination was a large concern, particularly from Vibrio parahemolyticus. Congruent with prior research, Smith et al. Found no additional risk of Vibrio contamination in shellfish. However, it was found that tar balls washed along the shore had 10 times more Vibrio vulnificus concentration than nearby sand samples, and 100 times the Vibrio concentration from seawater seed. Next, we got into the psychosocial studies. And the brunt of the impact fell to those who were employed and dependent on oil and fishing industries, creating extremely vulnerable populations. These populations experienced higher incidence of depression, anxiety, and alcohol misuse, with prior trauma history being a very strong factor. Resilience can be thought of as a relationship between risk and protective factors. The risks include low socioeconomic status, levels of education, trauma history, minority status, and lack of support structures, while protective factors include social ties, community involvement, and spirituality. And what's interesting is that highly religious communities are often thought to have high social support and resources for community members. However, in a study by Drakeford et al., They found that highly religious communities were actually detrimental to non-religious residents who had a lot harder of a time to get that same social support. These non-religious residents were more likely to experience maladaptive coping mechanisms such as alcohol misuse, perhaps because they have more difficulty drawing that social support, like I said. Lastly, there were recommendations for disaster planning and response. Community health workers are integral members of their communities who know the ins and outs and are trusted members and should be used. Nichols et al. Recommended that these community health workers be utilized in disaster response and that specialized training programs be implemented for them. Both Finucane and Lesson recommended various forms of adaptive systems approaches which address stakeholder needs. And then lastly, Sandifer and Walker provided recommendations for enhanced resilience within communities that are prone to disaster. So really quick to sum it all up, because this was a very, very long paper as well. The large quantities of dispersants used to disperse oil spilled during the Deepwater Horizon event raised a number of direct and potential human health concerns, including possibilities that compounds comprising the dispersant mixture may be human obesogens, and that aerosolization of oil particles mixed with dispersants may impact human health via inhalation. Secondly, direct contamination with oil may be related to pulmonary problems in humans, seafood safety issues, potential increases in harmful algal blooms, and higher populations of pathogenic Vibrio bacteria in the environment. While the increased contamination of shellfish by Vibrio was not observed, tar balls were found to contain larger numbers of the pathogenic species and hence might be a potential public health risk, especially from human exposure to the highly virulent Vibrio vulnificus. Buried oil and oil dispersant mixtures on beaches were also identified as possible long-term exposure routes for PAHs and also obesogens. Highly vulnerable populations are those who live in rural communities. They are heavily reliant upon natural resource-based employment and lifestyles, and they are most affected by disaster-associated stress and increased prevalence of depression, anxiety, and alcohol misuse. Trauma history was the most significant predictor of negative outcomes, such as depression, illness, anxiety, and alcohol abuse. Communities having a higher level of religious practice may help mitigate negative effects of disaster, notably for the religious community members, while non-religious members were not able to attain that same social support. Strong community attachment, however, appears to help mitigate impacts, strengthen resilience, and enhance recovery in some circumstances. And then lastly, several improvements to U.S. disaster response capacity that can reduce human health impact of a future oil spill or other disasters include a framework for self-evaluative and adaptive system, training greater use of community health workers, improving community resilience via an informed focus on stress relief and disaster preparedness response and recovery programs. And then lastly, while direct human exposure to contaminants is an important impact of a disaster, such as an oil spill, the magnitude of the Deepwater Horizon, potential mental and behavioral health impacts should also be a primary concern. That was all of part one of the project. Part two is the analysis of coastal exposure within the Gulf of Mexico and its impacts on subjective general health to answer the question of whether residing near coastal blue spaces is associated with negative, positive, or neutral effects in the health of Gulf of Mexico residents. So each year, the Behavioral Risk Factor Survey or Surveillance System BRFIS survey is conducted by the CDC. It's over the telephone amongst all 50 United States, asking participants, sorry, you can hear that, asking participants to self-report on many health behaviors and conditions. Questionnaires are grouped into three categories: the core questions, optional modules, and state-added questions. All individuals surveyed are asked the core questions. Each state decides which optional modules they would like to ask all participants within the state, and then states also have the ability to create their own questions. And to make sure that I was able to compare all of them, I limited my analysis to data derived only from the core questions because I would be sure that all of them would be asked the same questions. The BRFIS selected metropolitan micropolitan area risk trends, or SMART data, were used to allow comparisons of coastal communities within the Gulf Coast to non-coastal areas in the United States. The SMART data are weighted and analyzed by the CDC to provide a more localized picture of health rather than simply statewide estimates of prevalence. To make those small area estimates, the CDC compiles data from geographic subdivisions known as MMSAs. And for an MMSA to be included in the BRFIS SMART data, there must be at least 500 respondents. Here is my sample area. Because coastal and shoreline counties bear the greatest proportion of coastal effects, for the purposes of the study, only MMSAs with coastal boundaries within the Gulf of Mexico states were included. In the most recent year of available data at the onset of this study, which they, of course, released the 2018 data like a month later, 8 MMSAs fit the criteria for this research within the Gulf of Mexico, and comparison non-coastal MMSAs were chosen based on demographic similarities using a similarity search in GIS. Unfortunately, due to the limited number of MMSAs in the data sets, no SMART data sets were available for coastal communities in Mississippi or Alabama, and comparison communities were not always available in the same state, but I did limit it all to the same southeastern region. The coastal group consists of 8 MMSAs, while the comparison group encompasses only 6. Accumulated data were used for these comparisons rather than trying to pair MMSAs together for comparison. Next, you can see a list of all the variables included in the study. Of the variables included in the SMART data set, subjective, also known as self-reported general health, was chosen as the dependent variable, including its subcomponents of mental and physical health. This choice was based on results of previous studies that reported that views of or distance from the coastline were associated with more positive self-reported health metrics, such as reduced depression in older adults, higher odds of having good general health, more positive self-reported health, and enhanced subjective well-being, and opportunities for increased physical activity. So that's why I decided to use that as the dependent variable. The BRFIS survey does not include questions relating to blue space visibility. So while it would be beneficial, it's impossible to affect the effects of blue space visibility using that SMART data. Not all residents living near the coast will necessarily have a view of the coast itself, and even living 2 or 3 streets away from the coast may hinder that visibility if there is any. While the SMART BRFIS data does not quantify blue space or green space exposure, quite a few national data sets are publicly available and allowed for geospatial analysis of opportunities for both blue and green space exposure within the study areas, which you can see on the right-hand side. The BRFIS variables were downloaded from the CDC website and put it into IBM's SPSS statistical software, which is able to account for the complex sampling methods. Missing, don't know, or refused values were excluded from analysis, and geographic variables were downloaded from a number of databases, which I can tell you, but you can also read it. Now into the fun parts, the statistics. Due to the complex sampling design, comparing means was not amenable to statistical comparisons. However, by taking a quick look, it appears that self-reported general health of residents in coastal and non-coastal MMSAs were extremely similar. A stepwise regression of the total study population using coastal and comparison was conducted manually to create a final model. A total of 22 SMART BRFIS variables were analyzed, with all but one variable, which was, have you ever been told that you had skin cancer, were contributing to the model's R-squared value, even if it was only by 0.001. To reduce the number of variables, I only kept variables in the model if they increased R-squared value by greater than 0.005, which was chosen based on the model's performance. So I wanted to know if location alone would impact general health, so the geographic characteristics. To assess that, I created a model using general health as the dependent variable with all the geographic variables within the complex samples module of SPSS, which is required to use to account for the sampling design. Significant associations within this model were barren land, wetlands, average distance to a park, median years that the structures were built, and then the median house value within those MMSAs. Here are the descriptive statistics for the means of geographic and SMART variables separated into coastal and comparison groups. If you are interested in MMSA level comparisons, it can be found in the appendices of my paper, but be warned, it is a really, really, really big chunk of information, so I decided to not overwhelm anyone else with that. The coastal MMSAs have substantially higher percentages of open water, wetlands, shoreline miles per square mile, and miles of marine protected areas and parks, while having much smaller average park distance. Conversely, comparison non-coastal MMSAs have substantially more green space, unsurprisingly, and newer home construction. Here is the full model comparing BRFS SMART and geographic variables for the full study population. Here, a positive coefficient indicates that as the coefficient increases, so does the mean of the dependent variable. Since general health is scored on a Likert scale, with 1 being best and 5 being worst, positive coefficient indicate poor subjective general health, while a negative coefficient indicates better subjective general health, which can be very confusing at times. Having 0 days when physical or mental health was not good were significantly associated with better subjective general health and had smaller coefficients than the significant 1 to 13 days when mental or physical health was not good, indicating an increased effect on general health, which makes sense. For health-related characteristics, being diagnosed with a heart attack, angina, or coronary heart disease, cancer, excluding skin cancer, COPD, and arthritis were all, again, unsurprisingly, significantly associated with poor subjective general health, which makes sense. General health was positively correlated with all levels of employment status. However, being employed for wages, self-employed, a homemaker, or a student all had higher coefficients than being out of work for 1 year or more, out of work for less than 1 year, or being retired, which indicates incrementally better subjective health for respondents who were employed, self-employed, homemakers, or students, compared to those who were out of work or retired. There's similar inferences can be made about body mass index, levels of education completed, and income categories by looking at those coefficient values. It is important to note that race and ethnicity were not found to be significant when looking at the full study population. And then as for geographic variables, higher percentages of open water, developed areas, wetlands, and green spaces were all significantly associated with poor general health, while shoreline miles per square mile and miles of marine protected areas and parks were actually associated with better general health. So these were very surprising. To compare subjective general health of coastal versus non-coastal MMSAs, 2 additional models were created using the same BRFS SMART variables. But the limited number of geographic variables per MMSA, only having 1 value for each MMSA, was not sufficient to produce results for the geographic variables within these models, and that's why they're not included. Students in coastal MMSAs reported higher levels of general health than non-coastal students. Retired individuals and those employed for wages also indicated higher levels of general health comparatively, and white-only non-Hispanic residents within coastal MMSAs had significantly better general health. And additionally, I made more models. Using physical health, the number of days in the last 30 days that physical health was not good, And mental health, the number of dates in the last 30 days that mental health was not good as the dependent variables to assess whether there were more nuanced differences in physical health and mental health in relation to those geographic variables. Here, as the coefficient increases, the mean of the dependent variable also increases, which means that a positive coefficient indicates a greater number of poor mental or physical health days. So just like general health, negative is good, positive is bad. Sorry, said that the wrong way. Negative is bad, or wrong way, sorry. As, where was I? Sorry. A positive coefficient is a worse effect, and a negative is a more positive effect. It was a mess trying to go through all of these so many times. For the mental health model, open water, developed area, wetlands, and green spaces were associated with more days of poor mental health, which was surprising, while miles of marine protected areas and parks were associated with fewer days of poor mental health. So that's a positive effect. For the physical health model, I found that developed area, wetlands, and green spaces were again associated with more days of poor physical health. And then barren land was found to have positive effects, which was based on prior research on human health and blue spaces discussed in the introduction. We would think, in the literature review, one would think that blue space exposure would be positively associated with better levels of subjective general health. Results of this study, however, showed negative associations with a lot of the geographic variables. Interestingly, miles of marine protected areas and parks were associated with increased subjective general health as well as mental health. Research suggests that parks and protected areas contribute to physical, mental, spiritual, social, and environmental well-being. And then positive implications of parks are also supported by other studies which found that individuals visiting suburban parks were more likely to have higher levels of perceived health, engaged in physical activity, and higher levels of expected and perceived benefits from visiting those parks. Additional research is still needed to understand what types of physical activity are more likely to result in higher perceived physical health, so that areas can be designed to promote that activity. Results highlight the need for additional management strategies within those parks and marine protected areas to encourage and promote physical activity. Additionally, open water, developed area, wetlands, and green spaces were negatively associated with poor mental health, while barren land was associated with fewer poor mental health days. These results differ considerably from previous studies associated open water and green spaces with positive mental health effects, again as discussed in the literature review. Better health in coastal areas is thought to be due to less stress, increased mental health, greater social interactions, and better environmental quality. However, studies supporting these hypotheses are limited to beach exposure or just having a view of the coastline. In a study by Huiberg this year, he noted that coastlines are often mosaic patterns of urban, rural, and natural areas, and so benefits from exposure to one type of environment can also be masked by another, which may be happening here. More so, the role of disaster history and negative environmental factors were not addressed in previous studies and may also be considerably impacting results. Then we have limitations. Compared to other blue space studies, this analysis relied on large-scale surveys and data sets that were already existing rather than creating smaller ones. Questions regarding individuals' exposures to geographic variables were not included in the Burfist survey, so it doesn't measure those individual exposures, but rather what is geographically available within their MMSA. Comparability amongst blue space studies is also difficult because there is currently no standard for distance from blue spaces. For example, one study may use a 1 mile radius, while another may use a 5 mile radius as a metric for exposure to blue spaces. For example, in their study, Huiberg et al. Found that general health was only significantly associated with subjective general health, when respondents lived less than 5 kilometers from the coast, compared to 50 to 100 kilometers from it. At that range, they found no significance. Because of the sampling design of the BRFS, estimating distance to the coast to that degree would not be possible, which also limits the results. More so, the BRFS SMART data rely on self-reported data and subjective evaluations of one's own general physical and mental health status. Respondents were also not asked how long they had resided in their MMSA, which could also interfere with analysis. The coastal group was also limited to the Gulf of Mexico, which has experienced numerous natural and technological disasters in the last 10 years, as we've discussed. Trauma history may play a very large role in results, as well as potential exposures to chemical pollution, neither of which can be controlled for in this study. Because of the complex sampling design, it's also impossible to produce the smaller area estimates for more localized pictures of health or even more nuanced associations. And the complex sampling methods requires researchers to use very specific statistical software, which again restricts the type of models that can be created. In conclusion, this study suggests that coastal exposure negatively influences human health, particularly subjective general health status within the Gulf of Mexico. Results indicate that higher percentages of open water, developed area, wetlands, and green spaces within MMSAs are associated with higher levels of poor general health, conflicting with previous studies. However, shoreline miles per square mile and miles in marine protected areas and parks were shown to positively influence subjective general health. It's important to note that shoreline miles per square mile and marine protected areas and parks are not exclusive to coastal MMSAs, because they can include rivers and streams. These variables represent the possibility that blue space exposure is detrimental within the Gulf of Mexico, but it may not be in other areas. Part 1 of this project, Health Contributions of Montgomery, provides some potential reasoning for the negative health impacts of coastal exposure. Individuals reliant on natural resource-based employment were found to be particularly vulnerable to disaster-related stress, increased prevalence of depression, anxiety, and alcohol misuse, contributing to poor subjective health. These exposures may play a role in the associations between percentage of open water and subjective general health. And additionally, coastal populations may have been exposed to possible oesogens, which are endocrine-disrupting chemicals in or aerosolized particles resulting from the deep water horizon oil spill. Finally, the study by Kleberg et al. Found that distance from the coast, again less than 5 kilometers versus the 50 to 100 kilometers, has been shown to impact the significance of coastal exposure, which was not accounted for. And a review of blue space literature by Elliott et al. Actually points to the need for standardizations of this blue space exposure metrics. While not finding those same salutary effects of coastal exposure on Gulf of Mexico residents, this study still has relevance for policy and planning. Gulf of Mexico states and coastal Gulf of Mexico counties can better assess areas which may be at higher risk for poor health outcomes and integrate findings into their policy actions and disaster planning. The Gulf of Mexico represents a particularly vulnerable population to numerous environmental stressors, with chronic impacts, and future research is needed to address the role of disaster history as a contributor to poor general health. One potential for a future study would be to select coastal MMSAs not located in the Gulf and less prone to disasters to assess if there are significant human health differences. Additional research is still needed to assess the types of activity most beneficial to human health within those protected areas that policymakers and park managers can design to promote those activities. And finally, increasing the number of marine protected areas and parks and accessibility of those areas has a potential to better human health while protecting habitats of the foundational species within the ecosystem. That is the end. If anyone is interested in all 73 of the citations. Otherwise, does anybody have any questions?
before we get to questions, Ruth, let us thank you.
I'm also monitoring the chat board. If folks can't voice a question, they can put it in the chat function.
Okay, let's start with that. But thank you, Ruth. Very fine presentation. Much appreciated. And we will go to some. We can't give you a real hand, so you know, a virtual hand, a virtual. So let's go to questions.
I have a question, if I can just jump in.
Yeah.
Good job, Ruth. It was really interesting. So my question is about part 2 of your study with the statistical analysis. I was wondering if you were able to look at the demographics of the coastal versus the non-coastal groups and see whether or not age or income might have played a role in the results.
Let me go back to screen sharing so I can go back to that slide.
I might have missed it.
Go back. It's so hard to see when I have it all so tiny on the side. Sorry. I think you were talking about, so for looking at the comparison of the two, give me just a second. Sorry, here we
Oh, that's okay.
go. No!
Just use your up key. Go back to the view and use your up key.
No. Which one? This one. If I do it from up here. Here we go. Sorry. So you wanted to know about the demographic ones that can be found on this table where you can see, I don't know if, can you guys see my mouse on here?
Yeah.
Okay. So down here we have the demographic characteristics between income categories and whatnot. Unfortunately, because of the design of the BRFIS, it's weighted so that the demographics are representative of their area. That's how the survey is designed, so that you can get a better picture of the health for the whole state. So for example, if they were only able to get one Vietnamese respondent, but they know that they have a certain percentage, then they weight those so that they're higher. And then with the SMART data set, the way that we picked the comparison in coastal, we used a similarity search actually using demographics. So we were trying to make the demographics as similar as possible for comparisons.
Yeah, and I see you don't have age in here. That was one of my thoughts. I don't know.
Right. So age was actually not significantly associated. It was one of the variables that we looked at. We go back. Here we are. These are all of the variables that we initially put into the model. You can see sex, marital status, renting or owning your home. Those ones were actually not statistically significant, which was very surprising.
All right, thank you. Yeah, while you were speaking, that you did so much that it was hard to sometimes keep track of everything. But while you were
sorry, and I felt like it was going on forever. I realized as I was putting my presentation, I was like, holy crap, there's so much stuff.
Yeah, and while you were speaking, I just kept thinking about all the interactions that you might actually be observing too. I don't know if that might have been way outside the scope of your project, but maybe fodder for another project in the future. Like thinking about how, you know, income, unemployment, and proximity can perhaps see an effect.
Exactly.
Sort of think about what's happening now with unemployment rates and isolation, and everyone wants to get to a coast or a blue space to help improve their life. And so that your results made me think about that a bit. Thank you.
Who's next?
Does anybody else have any questions?
They could also put questions on the chat board. I don't know if Ruth, you see the chat, but I see the chat.
Let's see. No, I can't see it.
I can see the chat in case anyone wants to post a question to the chat board too.
And I'm just going to say to some of our students who are here, some of you are working with statistics that might be similar. You might want to ask questions about what she was using to do her statistics in, that sort of thing, for her to describe a little bit of that process. Hint, hint.
In other words, Ruth, would you describe that process?
Well, no, I was trying to get a particular person to ask it, but that's, yeah.
Okay.
But that's okay. Go for it, Ruth.
I can say that SPSS is much more user-friendly than SAS, which is what I originally tried to work with, and SAS made me want to cry. Not that that didn't happen at any point in this study, but SPSS was generally much easier to use and much more user-friendly. But because of the sampling design, I had to run everything through the complex sampling methods, which did limit a lot of the associations that I was able to do. For example, I had to do the stepwise regression by hand because complex samples doesn't have that in their module. So I had to add in each individual one, and I had a spreadsheet on the side tracking the change in R squared. So I was essentially doing what they usually do by themselves in regression analysis. So that was fun.
So I have a quick question, and again, I think you did a great job on both on the written thesis and in this presentation of a very comprehensive project. I think you did a really great job at summarizing the work, even though you felt a little in the weeds at times. It flowed really well. And I know you ended the presentation talking about potential limitations of your work and also future research, but if you were to be the one to create or to inspire one of our future MS students in continuing your work, what sort of focus would you suggest if they were to continue your work? What would they do?
Right, I think it would be really interesting to see, towards the end I brought up, it would be interesting if we were to choose MMSAs that were coastal, but not within the Gulf of Mexico. So I think that choosing ones in other regions to see if we're going to have those same negative health effects. So is it because blue space in coastal exposures is detrimental, or is it because it's detrimental in the Gulf of Mexico region because of all their trauma history that they've had, which was the reason why I chose the Gulf of Mexico for this study. But now that I've done it, I would love to see what it would look like if it wasn't having that same trauma history included.
Ruth, can I ask you a question about, did that get to yours, Annette? Sorry.
It did. It's fine. Good.
So I can't help, but think, I'm sitting here tearing my hair apart, like, why are some people benefiting and why are some people actually harmed by being in these green areas? And I can't help but think about development patterns over time, because rich people didn't live where they were most vulnerable on the coast. They tended to live away, and poor people tended to live closer to the water, and more resource dependent people. And then later, and actually only within the last 40 years, maybe 50 years, have rich people said, oh, I want to live near the coast, and move to the coast. And so I can't help wonder if that plays into this. And so can you remind me how long the preface has been used, and what was the temporal scope that you included in this? And if you didn't include it all, do you think you could go back maybe? I don't know. Or what else could you use? Big question.
Sorry. So for the length that the preface has been going on, I don't have that off the top of my head. I do know that you cannot compare data from the preface that was collected before they started using cell phones. So you can't compare, I believe it was before 2011. You can only use 2011 to current or from the start to 2011. So that's why I'm not quite sure on when the start of it was. So there's that. And then for temporal analysis, I did not do one, although that would be interesting. I did not look into the MMSAs because I was using smart data. So they only have certain metropolitan areas for each year that have enough respondents. So I'm not sure if they carry over the same ones each year. I have a feeling that they don't. But if we were to use the full FIRFIS data set rather than the SMART data set, you could definitely do a temporal analysis. But for the purposes of this, I only used 2017 data. I was on a little bit of a deadline, so
Yeah.
didn't quite have time.
And thank you. It's great to see the breakfast, you know, figuring out a way that you can use it for this kind of analysis. Can I ask one more question? So although this wasn't part of your work, I think it's something people are going to ask you or would ask you, you know, what do we need to do in these coastal areas that are actually detracting from people's health? Is there, I mean, did you give any thought to like what we could do to fix that? Have less oil spills? Yeah, that's a good answer. Is there anything else that could be done in those communities maybe to benefit people's health?
Right, again, like I think that you've already brought up is the development patterns that we've seen over the last 40 years. Like you said, we have a lot of very vulnerable populations living in the most vulnerable areas, just like what happened in Katrina. We had all of the most vulnerable populations living in the exact worst place to be. And so they bore the forefront of the issues. I think that's a big issue. And then as well as just looking into a little bit more on how those variables affect them, I think would have a greater impact. Again, knowing whether it's being exposed to coastal exposures or if it is being exposed to the coast only in the Gulf of Mexico setting.
Mm-hmm. I agree. It would be interesting. You can go on and do this somewhere else now. Thanks.
Other questions? Norm? Any from you? You're muted.
You're still muted, Norm.
I'm going to hold one or two questions that are more data specific so that you know, we're not bogging everybody down. I do want to ask one question. If you were, I mean, you summarized in your conclusions as you were talking about it not matching the previous studies in terms of being as healthy. Did you do you feel that what degree of confidence, so to say, do you have in that result?
In the result that is not as good. I mean,
Yes.
From the complex sampling method, I would have loved to be able to do more analysis using the different tests, which I think was a really big issue for this project, was just due to the sampling method and trying to take account that complex samples. There's not quite as much information online or even in their own statistical manuals for how to do things and how to exactly interpret results. So I'd say that I'm fairly confident, but if I were to have more time and more knowledge of how the statistical software works, I think it definitely would have been beneficial.
Okay. Landon, any questions?
I'm good for now. I feel like me and Ruth talk all the time, so I'll take this one for the smaller group.
Ruth, I've got a couple specific, but more general questions, not in the details. Two things you mentioned in the results of having positive effects that did not seem to be explored much in the discussion were the shoreline miles per square mile having a beneficial effect. And one that particularly interested me was coastal students having better self-reported health than non-coastal. And I'm just curious if these could be explored more with the data you have and with comparative literature. The same thing with the barren lands. The so-called barren land effect was positive, and you know, I've asked you before in looking through previous drafts, this is one of those things that maybe it's a lack of development that could be contributing there. I don't really know, but that's one of the places for some active speculation is in this discussion section where you can say this is a little odd, or this is an important finding. I don't know why, but it's really worth following up. And there are some papers, for example, that discuss the effects of green space and blue space on children, not so much on education, but that thing on the coastal students intrigued me a little bit.
Yes, that intrigued me as well. That was one of the analysis that I actually didn't run until closer to the end. And I actually added that section in between my last draft and this previous one.
So I did read it.
So I didn't quite have enough time to go through all of that. I did think it was very interesting. I didn't have time to do a literature review supporting it, but my general hypothesis would be that students who are able to afford to go to colleges that are in coastal areas are more likely to be more affluent and therefore more able to have increased subjective health, or that those students are also not bearing the brunt of those environmental factors that we've discussed because they usually wouldn't be residents of that area for long term.
Interesting, and I think that deserves a little bit. I've got one more of these kinds of questions, and that follows up on Barbara's question about some of the demographic effects and previous questions that Susan and I both asked you about race. There is now a statement in the current draft of the thesis that talks about white-only non-Hispanic respondents had significantly better subjective general health in it, and that's another one that doesn't seem to be explored any. I think you went back and did this analysis more recently too, but I'm questioning myself. Am I interpreting it correctly that the coastal whites had better general health than all other ethnic groups in coastal MMSAs, and than all groups, including whites, in the non-coastal? And I can't quite interpret this, so this may be an offline thing for you to do afterwards. But that's not surprising in the sense of perhaps the community, the people, the demographic trends on the coast for wealthier older people who are in better health. Just again, something that you may want to explore just a little bit more in your discussion.
Okay. I do believe that it was the coastal white only non-Hispanics. That wasn't that they were more, but it was the only significant race and ethnicity score. And then also what was interesting to me was that for the full population, none of the race or ethnicity scores categories were significant factors. It was only when I pulled it out into coastal versus non-coastal that it was significant difference.
Still raise some interesting questions. That's it for me. Others?
And it's positively correlated with that as well, which is significant and should be discussed.
That's just something that, again, leapt out of me in this draft, Ruth. And I know Susan had asked a question about race because it really wasn't explored at all in one of the previous drafts we looked at. So thank you for doing this, but I think a little bit more finesse that doesn't stop the thesis, but a little bit more on that.
Absolutely.
Anyone else have questions?
Great job, Ruth.
Thank you.
So I think we will ask our guests to depart.
Wonderful seeing everyone. Farewell.
Great to see you, Casey.
See you, Casey.
Great to see everybody else too. Thanks.
Hi, Luz.
Hi, guys. Good job, Ruth.
Hi, Lucy. All right, bye, guys.
Bye.
Annette,
Bye, y'all.
the co-host, so I'm leaving, okay?
I'm in control.
Thank you.
Cool. You are assigned for the control.
All right, I'll tell you, Lucy, when we're done.
That's good. Bye.
So Now we're down to the committee. And let me ask if there are any additional questions or concerns to raise for Ruth.
No, I had exactly the same questions about race that was just brought up. I think, you know, you're missing a little bit if you don't talk a little bit more about the racial dimension here. So that was my only thought really on improvements of the document.
I'll add to that, and once again, I think I commented earlier that the discussion needed to be beefed up. I thought the way that you presented the discussion, Ruth, was much better than the way it's written. I would actually go back to your notes because the discussion's about your work and how it compares with other people, and then in the written document, it looks like it sounds like it's about somebody else's work and kind of how yours fits in, and I think you need to flip that. So I think the way you presented it was great, and then adding these other points we've discussed. So hopefully you have good notes, and so you've already got it written. You just need to sew.
I think this is being recorded, so.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. And you can go back and
Yeah,
see the
there you go.
recording for more comment, but yeah, exactly. Which is nice. I had the same thing. It did jump out at me at the race. It also jumped out a little bit at
I'm
the
actually gonna stop the
income.
recording right now, actually. Let's pause it.